Um, First of all, good afternoon to all of you. And I am sad that I am not actually physically in the room with you. Thank you for being interested in learning about a very important part of our nation's history. And, I taught at UF for almost 20 years, and I taught the civil rights movement, a civil rights movement class. And one of the things that I really was trying to get our students to understand was that all of the rights that we take for granted, these rights were hard fought for. And so, as Dr. Bird has said to you, I was one of those foot soldiers in the civil rights movement. Uh, we were called field secretaries, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, field secretaries. And I can tell you, when I went to college in 1962, on a full scholarship and loans to Spelman College, the college of my dreams, I had no intention of getting involved in the civil rights movement. In fact, my grandmother, who was the primary parent, and my mother and stepfather, when they drove me to Atlanta from Memphis and spent some time there with me for freshman orientation, the civil rights movement, the student movement was really booming. And Atlanta was one of the main places. And so students were marching and sitting in and all of those things. And my grandmother kept saying, you had better not get involved in any of that. And on top of that, and I know it's always a surprise to learn that Spelman, a Black women's college there in Atlanta, told us during freshman orientation that we better not get involved. We could lose our scholarships, and that was the only way that I was there. Or even worse, additionally, I should say, we would be expelled if they found out we were involved. So clearly, given that it was not my intention, and with these kinds of threats, I had no intention of getting involved. But obviously, fate, destiny, what have you, had other plans for me. And I got in a class, and this is why I know so personally how important education is, because basically I had no idea who this teacher was, and I just signed up because the class seemed interesting. And it so happened that the teacher was Dr. Staunton Lind, whom I never knew anything about. And it was an American history class. And it was the first time that I really learned about the history of the enslavement period, and most importantly, the Reconstruction period, because I don't even know if I knew that word until I went into the class, and had no idea that at the end of the Civil War, our country almost, and I should say did, create a multiracial democracy in this country that was rolled back, that was undercut, that was killed off. And of course, I knew nothing about it. So of course, I didn't know how Jim Crow had begun. And of course, it comes after the Reconstruction period. And as a person growing up in Memphis, living under the Jim Crow laws, that was what I knew, even though it was very clear at my church, at my all Black school, all Black church, and in my family. People didn't like it. They thought it was wrong. And, I was taught always that these laws are wrong, that we Black people are just as good as white people. And don't you believe otherwise? So I had that teaching, but at the same time, I was being taught, don't buck the laws, don't go against it. And of course, when Dr. Martin Luther King came on the scene during the 1954 Montgomery bus boycott, people were elated over it, but terrified, that everybody was going to get killed over there in Montgomery. Nonetheless, moving ahead, I was aware that students had begun sitting in. You'd hear snatches of it on the news and stuff, but again, it wasn't really happening there in Memphis. So when I get to Atlanta, and it is happening, and there is a very organized, large student movement called the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. They were constantly recruiting us. And to get back to being in this class where I learned for the first time about the slave revolts and all of this, my mind was blown. And here, right on my campus, students from Morehouse, the all-male school across the street, Clark, Atlanta University across the street, Morris Brown up the street, many of those students, as well as grad students at the Atlanta University Center and the Interdenominational Theological Center. All of these students who were involved in this Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. And Julian Bond, that's a name you may remember or know of, was one of the main founders. So here was all this activity going on, and I'm in a classroom learning about all the struggles that had happened 100 years before. And so that began to break down my resolve that I wasn't going to get involved, but I was still terrified of, first of all, going against the school and going against my grandmother who had raised me. I loved her. And so anyway, to try to cut this down so we can have some Q&A, I began to, really carefully go and stand sort of and watch the demonstrations to see what really happened to people. And I saw that the police would tell you to disperse, and if you didn't want to get arrested. So I thought, well, I can do this as long as I don't stay long enough to go to jail. And the school will never find out. And so, I tried that for a while. But in addition to Staunton Lind, I hope you know the name Howard Zinn. He also taught at Spelman, and he was giving all kinds of lectures, and he was an advisor to SNCC. Anyway, I got more and more involved, and still avoided jail my freshman year, but was skating on thin ice, if you will. And then in the sophomore year, I got really involved and went to jail. And of course, the what hit the fan for me in terms of the school threatening me, my grandmother calling, threatening me, and all of that. But it was in the sophomore year that I learned, I already knew, but I was elected to SNCC's student coordinating committee. So that's why it's called SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because its board, if you will, was made up of student reps from across the South. And I knew that once I let my name be put up to be elected and to get elected, that I was in. I mean, I really knew that, I probably was going to get kicked out, and I don't know what my grandmother was going to do to me. But nonetheless, it was going to those meetings I learned about Mississippi Freedom Summer. Now, of course, growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, I had heard all my life about how bad Mississippi was and that the Klan was headquartered there. And while, there was Klan activity in Memphis, I had never seen any of it. But I had been told all my life that Mississippi is a dangerous place for Black people and that Black people could not register to vote. So when they said they were recruiting college students from all over the country to go to Mississippi to basically expose to the nation that this is a place where if you're Black and you try to register to vote, you could actually lose your life. You certainly will lose your job. You may lose your home. And this, this was so outrageous to me because, for some reason, Black people could vote in Tennessee without being killed. My grandmother was a proud registered voter and voted every time. So this was just shocking that, 50 miles from where I was born and raised, you could be killed if you were Black for registering to vote. It was just so outrageous to me that I was mad about it. And I said, yes, we have to go. Well, at the same time, I knew it was very dangerous. And of course, SNCC was able to, along with the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the SCLC, formed what was called COFO. And under the aegis of COFO, these students, almost 1,000, were recruited to sort of be a nonviolent army of voter registrants. Now, it was clear we were not going to be able to actually register people, even though we certainly tried. But the idea, and it was a brilliant one, was that we would have our own registration process. We called it a mock, M-O-C-K, registration process that we set up in churches, in barbershops, in beauty shops, in any organizational places that Black people owned. We had a registration process going on there. And so we were able to, in our own registration process, register thousands of people, because the idea was we were going to go in August of 1964 to the Democratic National Convention, and we were going to present all of these voter registration forms to show to the Democrats and to the world that thousands of Black people in the state of Mississippi would register to vote if they could. And of course, in addition to that, we were constantly taking people down to the courthouse, trying to get them registered to vote. I don't know how many of you know that often people were beaten. If you've ever seen Eyes on the Prize, and I think you absolutely have to watch that series, you can actually see what happened to people being beaten, being shoved, being arrested when they went to the courthouse. So we had this two-pronged process going on. As Dr. Bird has told you, I had planned to be a freedom school teacher because the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project had three main things that we were doing. We were certainly trying to get people registered to vote legally. And in addition, as I've explained to you, we had our own voter registration campaign. We were doing freedom schools so we could teach the children and adults, because we had adults who wanted schools, so we had to have schools in the evening too, when people got off from work, that were focused on democracy and the history of the United States and all of this. So that was what I was interested in doing, because I knew what learning that history had done for me. And I had signed up to be a freedom school teacher and had worked with Staunton Lynn, Dr. Lynn, on developing the curriculum and preparing the booklets that we took by the thousands into the state of Mississippi to use in our freedom schools. And thirdly, and most importantly, we were organizing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was going to challenge the Mississippi regular Democratic Party to be the representative of the state for the at the convention. And so I know I've gone on, but I wanted to just hopefully bring to you how difficult achieving the vote was in many parts of our country. So we really did not have a democracy until the passage of the 1964 voting, what was it called, Voting Rights Act. Because prior to that, you could not vote based on race. And of course, women didn't get the vote, until the 20s. So, when we hear all this talk about democracy in our own country, we did not have legal democracy until 1964. Were you going to break? Because I'll go on and ask me the next question.
Dr. Simmons, as you were talking, I was thinking of my area of research and where I'm from. You find that in the 1860s, one of the biggest things the Klan concerned themselves were a certain group of women of color who were helping to organize their communities. You'll find all the way for 100 years, women of color really being kind of the nemesis of these anti-democratic white supremacists. So in 1961, when the town that I'm from kind of puts in jail a whole group of activists, including people like Bob Moses and so forth, they actually locked Brenda Travis up, with no definite release date. They said, we're going to keep you in jail from 17 to 21, as if, something about her very existence was an existential threat to them. Why is it that women of color are such a threat to anti-democratic white supremacists?
Well, that's a good question, Dr. Bird. I think that the fact that women were in the forefront of our movements, even though you wouldn't know that from the history that is often taught, both in our schools, but also, in the media. Who do we hear about? We hear about Dr. King, we hear about John Lewis, we hear about, and certainly we should hear about them. But we often don't hear about the women who are the backbone of the movement. I think, in reality, women are tough, no matter, the sexist imagery that in the past, certainly when I was growing up, there was this effort to present us as not, warriors for our rights, etc. And of course, there are many reasons that women were beaten back over, so many eons. But here, women were very involved in the slave revolts. Women were very involved in Reconstruction, even though during the Reconstruction period, it was only men who could vote. But the women were involved in organizing to get the men to vote and to really influence who they voted for and all of that. And certainly in the civil rights movement, if I could just tell a brief story. When the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project was organized, the plan, which was carried out, was to have up to 1,000 students. And they were mainly white, and many of them from some of our most prestigious institutions, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, etc. And those students, we students, I should say, went for training, and they broke us into two groups to be trained at Western College for Women in Ohio. This is where the training took place. And because I basically was kicked out of my home by my grandmother and parents because I was going to Mississippi, and I won't go into the long story about how I had to basically threaten to call the police because I had been captured by my folks and driven from Atlanta back to Memphis against my will when the school found out that I was going to Mississippi and alerted my family. But nonetheless, SNCC put me on payroll, and payroll, by the way, was $10 a week. And Uncle Sam took 40 cents for taxes out of that. So we got a check for $9.60. So I was put on payroll, and because I became SNCC staff as one of the only people with no backup, no money, no family support, because most of the volunteers had to bring their own money and be able to support themselves. So of course, when we had the two groups, the first group, got the training, and people, these were mainly white, upper middle class young people. They weren't taking it seriously. They were like, well, how bad can it be? And I was saying, it's bad, guys. Listen to everything people are telling you to stay safe, because these people plan on killing us as soon as we get there. And they were like, get out of here. This is America. I said, Mississippi is not America as you know it. So anyway, and just to let you know, if you heard, hopefully you have heard of the three Mississippi martyrs, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. Well, Goodman and Cheney were at the first week of orientation. I met them, waved them off when they went with the first group on the buses and cars leaving Ohio to go to Mississippi. And then the second group comes, which is our last group. And I think it might have been the third day into the orientation, we were called out. We had a schedule. It was very rigorous training. And they broke the schedule and said it was an emergency, and we all had to go for plenary. And when we got there, Bob Moses, who was head of the Mississippi Project, it was his idea that he got from local people, by the way, about doing a focus in Mississippi on voting and not on, sitting in and trying to desegregate places. The local people told Bob Moses, we need the right to vote. And that's the most important thing here. So that was the genesis of Mississippi Freedom Summer. So that third day of the second week, we were called in. Jim Foreman, executive secretary of SNCC, Storton Lynn was on the stage, my professor who had stayed. He was the overall state coordinator of the Freedom Schools. Dr. Vincent Harding, who was also a professor and someone I became very close to. They were standing on the stage, called us all in, and they said, well, they've already started. They threatened to kill up as many of us as possible. And we want you to know that James Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman have disappeared in Neshoba County, Mississippi. And we know they're dead because there's no way that they would disappear for 3 days and nobody hear from them. Well, you can just imagine the hush that went over the auditorium of almost 500 people. And it totally changed, the tenor of the times, because everybody, including myself, even though I had been saying they plan to kill us down there, I don't think I believed it either. I certainly didn't think that they would kill white people, because I said, yeah, they'll kill Black people, but not white people. So Goodman was white, Schwerner was white, and they were dead, and we knew it. So everybody got, serious as a heart attack about safety rules and regulations. We had walkie-talkies, we had people on the main, whatever you call the thing that you call into the walkie-talkie on, I've forgotten what it's even called. There was every effort to try to keep us alive. And believe it or not, we were coordinating with the FBI and the Justice Department. So if somebody disappeared, you immediately had a hotline to the Justice Department, particularly after Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney disappeared. The FBI got serious because, as hopefully you may know, the FBI had a plant in the group that killed them. So we won't go there. But anyway, this is just to let you know how serious this was. And the women in the state of Mississippi, when Dr. Bird had asked me to name some of the people, I thought of Missy Berta Spinks, Miss Unita Blackwell, Miss Victoria Gray, Miss Annie Devine, Miss Susie Ruffin. These were the backbone of the work in Mississippi. And I have to try to contain myself, but when I was assigned to Laurel with 2 men, one of whom was to be the project director, we couldn't even go to Laurel because Laurel had no infrastructure, movement infrastructure. So we were told when we were getting ready to leave that we would go to Hattiesburg, 30 miles south of Laurel. And then we would drive up to Laurel every day with our list of NAACP members to see who was willing to help us start a project there in Laurel. And it so happened that I had a woman's name and address, and I knocked on her door, and she opened and said, "Yes, may I help you?" And I'm still trying to figure out, how do you ask somebody, can I live with you, knowing that that person's life was going to be put in jeopardy, job in jeopardy, house possibly bombed or burned? And yet that's what we were doing. We were asking people to put their lives, their livelihoods, and everything on the line to build a movement there. There was already a strong movement in many places in Mississippi, but Laurel was not one of them. And it was a Klan stronghold. So the movement, COFO, wanted something in Laurel. So this lady, I'm saying, this is the craziest thing in the world to ask this woman to do. And she looked me up and down and she said, "Are you one of those freedom riders?" And I didn't know if I should say yes or no, because I hadn't been on the freedom rides. And I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Girl, come on in here. I've been waiting on you all my life." And this was the lady in her 50s. I said, "You've been waiting on me all your life?" She said, "Oh yeah, come on in." And that was the beginning of the Laurel movement. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "Well, I need somewhere to stay." She said, "Well, you can stay here." I said, "Well, there are 2 guys. They need somewhere to stay." She said, "I'll call my neighbor. She'll put them up. What else do you need?" I said, "Well, they want to send more people here because this is how," and I laid out the project and all. And she said, "Oh yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it." And yes, she did. And we went from 3 people to 23 volunteers. every last one of them housed, fed, in the community. And it was the women who organized it. And it was the women who made the church open their doors so that we could have our mass meetings, our voter registration campaign, and all of that. So the women were the backbone in Laurel and in many, many other places. Sorry, it takes me so long to answer your question.
That's perfect. We want to just open it up for Q&A time. And I've even asked Dr. Simmons. Dr. Simmons was gracious enough recently to serve on my dissertation committee. Thank you again, Dr. Simmons. I've even asked her if she has any questions for you. So if it's like when she asks me questions, they're pretty tough ones. So I hope you can kind of be prepared for her to ask you questions. Would any students like to ask a question? And keep in mind, we can ask her about the past, we can ask her about the present. Just like these rights don't come to us automatically, they have to be earned. They also have to be defended or kind of recaptured. Edward, did you have a question on your mind? Could you please speak loudly so that Dr. Simmons can hear you?
Hi, Dr. Simmons. My name is Edward Zubay. I'm one of the student assistants here at the Bob Graham Center. You talked a lot about how voting is one of our constitutional rights that we shouldn't take for granted. And I think one of the things that we see in this generation is how we're becoming apolitical a little bit, or not willing to put our best foot forward in voting. So I want to say what advice you have to us in terms of getting people to vote more regularly and seeing it as a necessity as it was to your generation.
Thank you for that question. And let me say, even though I am, quite up in age, I'm still very involved with the Dream Defenders, local young organization founded here in the state of Florida, with a lot of the founding happening at UF, by the way, with some of my former students, Black Lives Matter, etc. I think that first of all, it's so important for people to be educated about the struggle for the vote, and for people to understand that the vote is your voice. And so, when you don't like things that are happening at your city, at your county, at your state, at your federal level, one of the main ways we change it, and it's not the only way, by the way, is by registering and voting in people who represent your views as best as possible. So voter education is critical. And this is what we did in the civil rights movement. And before, in the 50s and all, this whole idea of educating people, because if people think, well, it doesn't matter who's in office, things don't get any better for me, no matter who's up there, Dems, Republicans, they don't really care about me. They just want my vote, and then they go and do what they want. So this education is critical, and people have to be organized. And I know your students, but even on your campus, you can have organizations that educate you all about the issues and about what it is you think needs to be done. And so you vote people in, but you hold those people accountable. It's not vote and done. Vote and stay engaged, stay on top of them, and let them know you will not be reelected if you don't follow through on the things you promised. So being a citizen in a democracy requires involvement. Otherwise, somebody else is directing what happens to your life.
We just want to make sure that if any of you need to leave, that's fine. We're going to continue the discussion. So in that frame, like I say, if anybody needs to go, that's fine. Another question for Dr. Simmons?
And just one other comment, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
A couple people have approached me asking how to get the recording. The fact that you were here, it'll be on our website, it'll be on YouTube. So don't be afraid to go to class. That's where you should go first. And we will send that around to you after.
Yeah, you go class,
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah, well, my name's Evan. My question is, what do you see as the parallels between the civil rights and, racial justice movement in the sixties, continued to today? So, the Black Lives Matter movement, the continued racial justice movement, what do you see as the parallels, like the differences and the similarities there?
That's an excellent question. As a civil rights vet, we call ourselves veterans. The movement was not completed, shall we say. I mean, certainly we made tremendous strides. I mean, basically we got rid of Jim Crow. I mean, and that, if you didn't live under Jim Crow, it might not seem like much, but when you couldn't go to restaurants or you couldn't sit at the front of the bus or anywhere else on the bus, you wanted to sit on trains, I mean, the humiliation of it all, we changed that. And many other things, changed as a result of that. And that was a primary Southern thing. But we really didn't change the economic situation. We didn't get to that. I mean, the labor movement of the 30s and 40s had done quite a lot to help people economically. But then, unfortunately, the labor movement, had died down, and we have very few people who are workers in labor unions in our country. It's shocking, compared to other industrialized countries. So there was still a lot to be done. And I think that what Black Lives Matter, the Dream Defenders, as you know, they arose primarily around the whole issue of the killing of Black and brown people by the police, because that was another issue that had not been addressed. And that is the role of the police and the criminal justice system when it comes to people of color primarily. So that was an issue that had not been addressed. Thank goodness we have Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. They are taking up the mantle of what Dr. King was working on right before he was assassinated, which was the Poor People's Campaign, saying that everyone deserved a job with a living wage, and if such jobs were not available, that they should be able to get an income while they train for jobs that will pay them a living wage. We have tremendous problems with housing. When I was growing up, I don't remember seeing a homeless person. Now, that had a lot to do with the culture and the fact that families took in, people who might have, fallen down on the luck and stuff like that. But clearly, this issue of housing, affordable housing for all, economic justice, economic rights, a living minimum wage, these things were not taken care of by the civil rights movement. So in many ways, this is just a continuation of the movement focused on things that were not addressed during what we call the civil rights movement.
Thank you so much.
Again, we're going to conclude around one, but is there another question? Or Dr. Simmons, do you have a question for the students that you'd like to pose to them as you can do?
Well, if does anybody else have a question? I certainly want to answer their questions. Anybody else?
Hi, Dr. Simmons. My name is
Hi.
Derek Peters, and my question kind of is, you talked about how when you were young and in college, you had all this opposition in regards to getting involved with the civil rights movement, especially from your parents and those who loved and cared about you. I wanted to ask, on the day that you decided to like finally put yourself forward, put yourself in line of fire, when you had all those oppositions running through your head, what was the piece of information or piece of inspiration that kind of pushed you over and said, despite all these obstacles, I'm still going to do this?
Great question.
Boy, that's an excellent question. I really don't know. As I've mentioned to you that, I had the teachers, both Staunton Lynn and Howard Zinn. I didn't mention, first of all, I was brought up as a devout Baptist, and that was the other command that I was given by my grandmother, was to join a church as soon as I could find one. And lo and behold, I did. And the church was just about 3 blocks from the Antioch University complex, where Spelman, Morehouse, and all those schools were. And little did I know that the pastor was Ralph David Abernathy. I mean, when I got to the church, I liked it. It reminded me of my own church there in Memphis. But after going for a couple of weeks and then joining, it was, everybody's got to be in the civil rights movement. Now, let me tell you, Ralph David Abernathy, if that name doesn't ring a bell, was Dr. Martin Luther King's right-hand lieutenant, I guess you could say, in the Montgomery bus boycott. They both had pastored in Montgomery, and they both left Montgomery, went to Atlanta to take large churches there in Atlanta. So the first time I ever laid eyes on Martin Luther King Jr. was in Ralph Abernathy's pulpit. It was the West 100th Street Baptist Church. So every Sunday I was hearing sermons that told me I had to get involved. And I had these teachers telling me the same thing. And then I had these SNCC folk who were my age, who had dropped out of school to work full time, telling me the same thing. So they wore me down. And once I made up my mind that I was going to do it, I mean, I guess you could say neither hell nor high water was going to change it. I had been convinced over a 2-year period. Now, it was painful to go against my folks. And I can tell you, I cried all the way on the Greyhound bus from Memphis to Atlanta, because my grandmother said, if you go, don't ever come back. Well, I didn't have any other family. And my mother was there when she said it. My father was there, and they were backing her up. And I was like, they're going to throw me out for working in the civil. I mean, I was so hurt, but I was also mad. So anyway, I cried all the way to Atlanta, and Staunton Lynn and his wife, Alice, and the 2 kids, they met me at the bus station, and they could tell I'd been crying. I was, my eyes were red, I was swollen face. And they were like, you did the right thing. We're your family now. Don't worry, And then I went to the SNCC office, and they all were hugging and kissing me and saying, we're your family now. So, it's something to have organizations that are going to support you. And often, we don't have that now. So it's a lot harder. We have to build organizations to support all of us who are in the movement. And I'm an organization person. I believe in organizing an organization. And that's why I'm in several to this day, still working for human rights, civil rights, and peace.
Thank you. We've got just a few minutes. Anybody want to ask a concluding question?
Hey, Dr. Simmons, my name is Joshua Thomas, and my question is, how do you think we can best combat voter suppression in 2022?
We combat it by organizing. I mean, listen, everybody has to know that the reason the civil rights movement was successful was because it was organized. we had organization. And we have to be organized because the people who are working on voter suppression, they are organized. This is no haphazard thing, guys. This is planned and executed with precision. And we have to do the same thing. We have to educate, we have to motivate, and we have to not only get people registered and out to the polls, but that's just, that's a big step. But we have to be organized. We had lawyers, we had people who were professors of political science and history, and they worked with us in helping us to come up with the whole idea that we could go to the convention in August of 1964, the Democratic Convention, and that we could challenge the regulars. I mean, you had political scientists who had to help us because, we were kids. We didn't know we could do this. We were like, what? Really? We can challenge them? I mean, so you have to be organized. You have to have your resources. And we had a bevy of lawyers working free of charge to get us out of jail. People putting up their property for our bond. I mean, you talking organization. Civil rights movement was organized. And it's only with organization will we defeat those people who are attempting to steal our votes from us and steal our right to determine our future.
Let's give Dr. Simmons a hand.
Thank you. And listen, we can do this. We did it and we can do this. So don't think that we can't win, because we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons.